The cannon smoke had barely cleared when the screaming began. A merchant captain, stripped to his waist and lashed to the mast of his own ship, watched in horror as two figures approached through the haze, not the bearded brutes he'd expected, but women, their cutlasses still dripping with the blood of his crew. Anne Bonny tilted her head with a smile that promised nothing good, while Mary Red casually wiped her blade on a dead man's coat. "Thought you'd surrender to men, did you?" Bonny's voice cut through the groans of the dying. "How embarrassing for you. What followed wasn't just robbery or murder. It was theater, punishment, and a masterclass in terror that would haunt Caribbean waters for decades." These weren't damsels playing dress-up. They were architects of agony who understood that fear, properly cultivated, was far more valuable than gold. A thing about female pirates that polite history conveniently forgets is just how creative they became with punishment. See when you a woman in the early 1700s trying to maintain authority over a crew of murderous sea rats who thus spent their entire lives being told you the weaker sex, you doing just match their brutality. You exceeded in ways that make them question everything they thought they knew. Anne Bonny and Mary Read didn't just fight alongside men. They developed a reputation for punishments so psychologically twisted that captured sailors would literally beg to be handed over to male pirates instead. Court records from their eventual trial in 1720 revealed testimony from survivors that has been sanitized over the centuries. But the original depositions paint a far darker picture. One merchant sailor described being forced to watch as Bonny personally keel-hauled a man who tried to hide a gold ring not once but 3 times, each passed slower than the last, until the barnacles on the ship's hull had scraped him down to something barely recognizable as human. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. She made his captain count each pass out loud, and when the captain's voice cracked with horror on the second count, Bonny added another pass for poor showmanship. The psychological warfare was the point. These women understood something that most pirates missed: breaking a man's mind was far more efficient than just breaking his body. The below-deck prisons on pirate ships were universally horrific, but accounts suggest that Bonny and Read introduced refinements that turned standard captivity into something approaching performance art. Traditional pirates would chain prisoners in the hold and largely forget about them until they were needed. Bonny and Red, they turned imprisonment into a daily ritual of degradation. Multiple survivors testified that prisoners were chained in pairs specifically. Merchant captains were shackled to their own cabin boys or lowest-ranking crew members. Forced into an intimacy that destroyed the social hierarchies these men had spent lifetimes building. The upper-class captain, who'd never so much as touched a common sailor, now had to share his waste bucket with one, unable to move more than a foot apart. They were fed only once per day, but here's the twist: the food was lowered in a single bowl, forcing them to negotiate, to beg, to literally fight over scraps, while the pirate crew watched and placed bets. Some prisoners were given slightly more food than others, deliberately engineering resentment and violence among the captives. Read, who'd spent years disguised as a man in the British military, apparently had a favorite technique. She de-identified prisoners with officer training and forced them to drill the other captives in military formations while chained, beating anyone who broke rank. The absurdity was intentional. Watching dignified naval officers try to maintain military discipline while starving, chained and covered in their own filth, was entertainment. But it was also functional. By the time these prisoners were either ransomed or released, they'd been so thoroughly broken that their testimony about pirate brutality served as better advertising than any black flag. The real genius of their prison system, though, was the illusion of hope they'd cultivate just to crush it. Every few days, Bonny would descend into the hold and announce that one prisoner would be released. They'd hold a lottery where captives would draw straws or shells. The winner would be unchained, cleaned up, given fresh clothes, and brought on deck in full view of everyone. Then, just as hope was swelling, just as the other prisoners were imagining their own release, Bonny or Read would slit the winner's throat and throw the body overboard, explaining to the remaining prisoners that this was release, technically. "We're women of our word," Bonny reportedly said during one such incident, according to a deposition given by a survivor named Thomas Dillon. "We never specified what kind of release. This happened repeatedly, and yet prisoners continued to draw straws, continued to hope, because the human mind simply cannot accept that no mercy exists. That's the part that's truly chilling, not just the violence, but the deep understanding of psychology these women possessed. They weren't educated in the traditional sense, but they'd earned advanced degrees in human nature from the brutal University of Survival, and they applied their knowledge with scientific precision to ensure that every captive became a living ghost story, every survivor a warning, every tale told in port taverns a recruitment poster written in terror. Marooning was common enough among pirates, sure, but what made Bonny and Reed's version particularly nightmarish was their understanding of time and hope, specifically how to weaponize both. Standard pirate practice involved dumping someone on a deserted quay with minimal supplies and sailing away. Clean, simple, done. But these women turned abandonment into an extended psychological experiment that makes modern horror films look quaint. They'd maroon their victims, yes, but on islands they knew received occasional passing ships, not enough to guarantee rescue, but enough to make survival feel possible. Then they'd return, sometimes weeks later, to check on their handiwork. One account from a rescued Dutch sailor named Peter Clausen describes being marooned with 3 others on a small island in the Bahamas, given the standard pistol, powder, and water. They'd resigned themselves to death when 2 weeks later, the revenge returned. Bonny and Reed came ashore personally, bringing fresh water and dried meat. They nursed the starving men back to health over 3 days, cleaned their wounds, let them sleep in actual beds aboard the ship. Then, once the men had recovered enough to really appreciate being alive again, the pirates marooned them on a different island, this time without any supplies at all, explaining that they used up their allowance. Only one of those 4 men survived to tell the tale, rescued 6 weeks later by a Spanish fishing vessel, and his testimony at the trial was so disturbing that the court initially dismissed it as delirium. But multiple other accounts corroborated the pattern. Bonny and Reed had apparently turned marooning into a game with variable difficulty settings. Some victims were left with supplies on habitable islands. These were the easy mode punishments, usually reserved for crew members who'd merely annoyed them. Medium mode involved decent islands, but no supplies, testing pure survival skill. Hard mode, and this is where it gets properly disturbing, involved islands that seemed habitable, but weren't. As an account of a merchant captain being marooned on an island in the Exumas that appeared lush with fruit trees, only to discover every single piece of fruit on the island was a manchineel, a tree so toxic that even standing under it in the rain causes. Blistering and eating its fruit leads to an agonizing death. The pirates knew. They'd marked the island on their charts with a skull. They'd deliberately chosen a location that looked like paradise, but was actually a botanical death trap. And they depositioned the captain facing the fruit trees, so that would be the first thing he saw when he woke up thirsty and starving. The psychological cruelty is almost artistic, presenting salvation that's actually damnation, making a man's own survival instincts kill him. A Royal Navy patrol found the captain's body 3 months later, surrounded by half-eaten manchineel fruit, his journals documenting the slow realization of what he'd done to himself. Bonny had apparently told him the island was uninhabited but safe, even pointing out the fruit trees as a mercy. The last entry in his journal, written as the toxins destroyed his digestive tract, reportedly just read, "She knew. She knew. She knew." The whipping post aboard the Revenge became legendary, not for the severity of the beatings. Lots of ships had brutal floggings, but for the theatrical context Bonny and Reed created around them. They understood something fundamental about human nature. We can endure almost any physical pain if we understand its purpose and endpoint. so they made sure their victims understood neither. A standard naval flogging followed a formula: so many lashes for so much crime. Everyone knew the count, and when it was done, it was done. Bonny and Reed's floggings were improvisational performances where the rules changed mid-punishment, based on audience reaction. They'd announce 10 lashes, then pause after 5 to ask the assembled crew if they thought the victim had learned his lesson. If the crew showed too much sympathy, the count would increase. If they showed too little concern, Bonny would hand the whip to whoever seemed most indifferent and make them deliver the remaining strikes. Because if you did, and care about your fellow crew members' pain, you were going to be intimately involved in creating it. This turned every punishment into a collective trauma where everyone was complicit, everyone was compromised, and everyone understood that safety was an illusion that could be revoked at any moment. Reed, with her military background, apparently introduced a refinement that's barely documented but appears in several crew testimonies: measured flogging. Instead of delivering lashes in sequence, she'd administer them on a Schedule 1 lash, then a 10-minute wait. Another lash, another wait. The physical damage was often less severe than a traditional flogging, but the psychological impact was exponentially worse. Victims couldn't brace for a beating and have it done. They had to endure anticipation, relief, then anticipation again, over and over, for hours. Their bodies never got the adrenaline surge that helps with pain tolerance because the punishment kept stopping and starting. It was torture designed by someone who understood that the worst pain isn't what is happening. It's what you know is about to happen and can prevent. Some men begged for a traditional flogging instead, offering to take double the lashes if they could just have them all at once. The requests were always denied. One crew member named Samuel Fletcher testified that he'd once seen a man receive a measured 30 lashes delivered one at a time over 5 hours, and that, by the end, the victim was so psychologically shattered he couldn't stop crying even days later when his physical wounds had largely healed. The body recovered, the mind never did. The final twist in their punishment repertoire was something they called graduated mercy. And it's perhaps the most insidiously cruel thing they invented. When they captured a ship, they'd immediately identify the crew member who seemed most decent, the one who'd tried to help wounded comrades, who'd shared water, who'd shown basic humanity in crisis. That person would be singled out and given special treatment. Better food, no chains, allowed on deck. The other prisoners would watch this, and hope would bloom. If you're good, if you're cooperative, mercy is possible. After several days of this preferential treatment, Bonny and Reed would then force that person to participate in punishing the others. Make them administer floggings, make them decide who got food, and who didn't, make them become the instrument of suffering for the very people they'd tried to help. If they refused, everyone would be punished worse, and the crew would be told it was because of the good person's selfishness. If they complied, they'd be forced to watch their own humanity corrode in real time, becoming exactly the kind of person they'd defined themselves against. Either choice destroyed them. Either choice taught everyone watching that decency was a liability, that mercy was a trap, and that the only predictable thing in this floating hell was that nothing good would last. Survivors who experienced this reported that watching someone's conscience eat them alive was somehow worse than any physical torture, because it proved that everything that made you human could be weaponized against you. Bonny and Reed weren't just punishing bodies. They were running experiments in moral degradation, and they were disturbingly good at it.